be covering safety on the planers today. These are typical woodshop planers. This one is a 24-inch and this one is a 15-inch. What that means is how wide of a board you can send through the machine. These are fairly standard in any wood shop. The steps will be the same, although the machine may look a little bit different. The standard machine is a belt driven, and the switches on them are push button and toggle. The principal use of a planer is to take a board and plane it to a desired thickness, to machine it down to a thickness that you want. Secondary use would be in smoothing rough lumber, taking a rough edge and planing it down until you had a smooth edge in case you needed to glue something to it. Both the machines have some standard safety features. We have a table, we have a height stop, blade guard in the back, and the dust collection system. The height stop is really important. I once had a student take a board and send it through the planer. This is only supposed to take off this machine about 1/8 of an inch. And he ended up taking this board and setting it for the wrong height 5 times more than he was supposed to take off. And it was really intense. The machine started to shake. It sounded like a locomotive, like a train had entered the shop. The whole shop was shaking, and the belts that are inside this belt guard right here just completely evaporated, and it was like this smokestack of smoke, and the poor kid just froze up right in front of the machine. He just couldn't even move, and I was like, turn it off, and I ran over from the other side and hit the off button, but I was too late for the belts and for the kids' underwear. It was a done deal. Anyway, so the height stop is really important. You need to make sure that you set it for the precise height before you send your board through here. Okay, you're going to need some eye protection as well. A lot of the planers are pretty loud too, so some hearing protection is a good idea. You're also going to need a board that is correct for the machine. Let me talk about that. What happens is your board is going to be fed in, and the first roller catches it and feeds it into the cutter head. The cutter head machines off a small part, and then this roller is set down just a little bit, so it catches the lower part of the board now, and it feeds it on out. The problem is, if you send in a board that's too short, what's going to happen is it'll catch here and it'll push it into the cutter head, but then it won't make it to the far wheel. And if it doesn't make it to the far wheel and it pushes it far enough forward here, it's not catching here and it's not catching there, and it just gets ground up into confetti basically, and all goes out the DCS, and a lot of it will get thrown back out at the wrong height for you right there. If your board is too thin when you send it through, this first roller will catch it, but then instead of staying flat on the bottom, it will lift up a little bit and your whole board will get chewed up inside the machine instead of being fed out. There's nothing, once it passes the first roller, there's nothing to hold it down against the bottom, so it will just lift up and get turned into confetti as well there. It's really critical then that your board is the right length and it's also the right thickness so that it can feed through the machine. We have a 2-foot machine and we have a 15-inch machine. On the 2-foot, your board needs to be 13 inches long to catch both rollers. On the 15-inch machine, your board needs to be at least 6 inches long to catch both rollers and be fed out. Also, your board needs to be at least 1/4 inch thick when you send it through at the final pass. If it's less than 1/4 inch thick, that's when it gets chewed up. Some boards have foreign objects in it, like a nail or a rock or something like that, so you always need to visually inspect your board first before sending it through. This will totally screw up any of the blades on the planer. You also need to make sure that your grain, I haven't talked about that yet, your grain is the lines going sideways in a board. So these lines right here are called the grain, and what happens is you need to send those parallel to the machine when you feed it through. If I was to turn this sideways and try and send it through, besides not being long enough, what happens is the blade would come around and it would grab right about here. It would cut okay for the first part, but when you got down to the end, it would grab this whole line right here and just tear it out. And usually when it tears it out, it flings it back out at you, and it will pretty much destroy your board if you send something through cross grain. So you always want to send something through with the grain, plain with the grain direction. Also, this grain is, this is a little advanced, but if you want a really good finish, you always want to point your grain so it's pointing down when you send it through, and that will allow the cutter head to cut a clean cut as it cuts across the top. So in this direction, your grain is pretty much parallel, and it wouldn't mean it wouldn't make a difference when you planed it this way or this way. But sometimes if you get a little tuft of wood that sticks up in a whole bunch of places, that means you're planing the opposite direction of the grain, and if you spin it around, it will usually clean it up. Also, sometimes when you're planing, you'll run into a knot, and a knot has end grain, it's pointing the opposite direction, and that's another place you'll often get a tear out or a chip. It will bust apart. Sometimes when you get a board that has a real straight grain, it makes it really smooth, and if you have an older machine where the rollers are kind of worn out, sometimes it tends to slide on those, on the tough grain or on the slick grain. So you need to put your board in just a little bit at an angle so that it can catch across that grain and pull it through easier. You don't want too much of an angle. If it catches and turns sideways, it's going to completely chew up your board. But a little bit of an angle tends to help the finish on your project and help pull it through a little better. Sometimes you can also send a board through a little bit at an angle, and this distance will be longer than this distance. So if you send it through a little bit at an angle, if this is 13 inches, then it will work correctly through the big planer. Or if it's 6 inches this way, then it will still work. If you turn it this way and it's less than 13 inches though, or less than 6, it won't work in those machines.